We are continuing our Nifty and Cool series for evangelism. And today I want to talk about something very, very practical. If you have the book Workplace Grace, we are in chapter 6, which is called Fostering Curiosity. Fostering Curiosity. The guy in the book, his point has been pretty simple. He says that there's lots of different ways people have done evangelism. There's lots of different ways evangelism could be done. And he goes on and he's talked about those different ways. He's talked about evangelism by getting a big crowd together and preaching to a large audience, like a crusade or some sort of big public event. And I gave the example of the church I was at in Illinois where we did something on the town square and had a band from the Baptist college that I graduated from show up and get a crowd together and preach the gospel to them. There's another one where, another style where you deliberately try and have provocative conversations with someone and deliberately put the gospel and put Jesus out there very, very boldly. Not rude, but very, very boldly, like knocking on people's doors, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, but actually with the real gospel. Knocking on people's doors and initiating bold conversations with people. And some people can do that, and some people are just not good at that kind of thing. And we gave the example of Campus Crusade for Christ and some other methods that really take that way. We've talked about something the author called intentional evangelism, where you try and just get people together in a non-threatening environment to talk about the gospel and let people ask questions. Instead of getting people together so you can talk at them, telling them that you're a sinner and you need Jesus, or you're in big trouble, you're going to go to hell, and God sent Jesus to save you. Instead of getting people together to talk at them, you get them together to have a conversation, which is like the thing we did at the library in February before COVID ruined everything, and the thing we're going to do on Zoom, start up again in the next few weeks once the web page for it is finished. Things like that. And he gave the example of how when Matthew was first converted, he invited his friends to his house for dinner, and he invited Jesus to come along as well. The other method the author talked about is doing things on purpose to sort of provoke conversation, like having a Bible sitting around or wearing religious art, necklaces, jewelry, stuff like that, doing things and putting out Christian symbols intentionally so that hopefully people will ask a question about it. Why do you have that cross around your neck? What does that mean?
Yes.
And
I love your t-shirt, Demetrius.
Yeah, Demetrius wearing a t-shirt that says, "Be salty," has the verse quote from Matthew.
Still need to know what company you buy those from. This is like Queen Apparel. Nice.
So stuff like that to make people say, what does that mean? And then the other one that he mentioned is a relational kind of evangelism. You make friends because you care about people, and also so you can share the gospel with people because you know them and you trust them. And the author is really big on, we need to spread the gospel through relationships, through friendships, through people you know, through people you deliberately try to know, so you have a chance to give them the gospel. Not that other methods haven't worked, but this is one method that really works well, and a lot of these blend together. And we left it last time, or a few times ago, but we've come back to it, of this analogy of this farming model to get across how people come to faith, this cycle of cultivating, planting, harvesting, and multiplying. You sow seeds, you water it, you wait for it to grow, you care for it while it's growing, and then eventually you reap the harvest. And if you use that analogy to think of how people come to faith, people are at different stages. Perhaps no seed's ever been planted in their heart. Perhaps a seed has been planted, but nothing's happening with it, and they need some help along, or questions answered, or just genuine Christian friendships to help make that seed start sprouting. Or maybe the seed is sprouting and that they really need fellowship and lots of questions answered about the gospel. So there's different steps along the way to someone coming to faith. Another author we talked about, his name's Tom Rainer, uses this 5-stage series of doors. The first one is the door is totally closed. People don't care about the gospel, they don't want to hear it. And then there's this graduated series that the door opens a little more along the way to level 1, where the door is totally open. and the person is receptive to hear the gospel. Like the Philippian jailer, what must I do to be saved? And both of those models get the point across. There's it's a process where someone comes to faith, and we don't know where someone is in the process unless we get to know them. The more you know people, the more you know where the person is and how you can talk to the person. And we spent last time talking about we need to know who we're talking to, which means we need to know people, which means we should make friends with people. So the book's claim is that evangelism is most naturally done over time and with people you know and have influence with. So as you go about your life, you identify people with whom you have regular contact. You pray for God to give you an open door to speak to those people. And you pray for wisdom to develop this relationship so you continue to know them and know them better. And what we're going to focus on in this chapter is what the author suggests is to play the long game and to plant flags that mark your Christian faith in the course of normal conversation as you develop your relationship with the person.
Although I would nuance that to say it's playing the long game. In a sense, it's a bit like you're feeling out what the Holy Spirit is doing with that person.
Yeah.
And so it's not that it's necessarily going to take a year. Hopefully it doesn't. But you're trying to be sensitive enough to what are their questions, what's their readiness, so that when the Holy Spirit has brought them to a place where they are ready to consider the gospel intentionally, you have your finger on that pulse. And that's more of what this is going for. Whether it takes a day or whether it takes 2 years will depend a lot on what the Holy Spirit's doing.
And were you going to say something, Tim?
No.
Okay. Heard rustling on the phone, so I thought, okay. So what we want to talk about today is a concept the author calls faith flags. And this book, Workplace Grace, was first recommended to me by a retired pastor in Illinois. He's the regional rep for the Illinois and Missouri General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. So he's Dave Lunsford for the Illinois and Missouri area. And he did a thing where he got pastors in the region together, and he did like a book. They read a book together and talked about it, and they met once a month. And so he would always drive and get guys together at one guy's church or somewhere and do these book study things to encourage pastors. And he told us that this book changed the way he thought about how to share your faith. And it was such a liberating concept to him, because he's older, and his whole life he'd been taught that evangelism is where you have to sit someone down and you basically have to go through an entire presentation. And then if you can't make it through the entire presentation, or you don't have time to go through the whole presentation, that you somehow not that you've failed because you can't control everything, but it's sort of incomplete. You haven't succeeded in your goal. But that was a style that was common. You need to get someone down, you need to give them the whole thing. And so he lived his Christian life with this sense of, even though he's a pastor, sort of this sense of guilt and this sense of, I must not be very good at this kind of thing, because it's hard to, unless you get someone to come to church, it's hard to give them everything at once. And it was just sort of, he'd never really been taught any other model, or basically some variations of, you have to give someone the whole thing. The author here talks about faith flags, where if you're developing a relationship with someone, instead of trying to give everything to someone, your job, like Andrew said, is to plant seeds in the course of normal conversation and ask God to help develop that into something, or see if the person picks up on it and go from there. So I'll read his definition and then I'll give a few examples. He says, a faith flag is a brief mention or statement about God, the Bible, or prayer, and the natural course of conversation that communicates that we have a spiritual dimension. A faith flag, number one, provides a snapshot of who we are and what we believe. Number two, helps identify us as individuals to whom faith is important. And number three, can open up opportunities for further discussion about spiritual topics.
Yeah, so I can give you an example. It's generally So I tutor right now, especially with the schools generally. And for example, this week, a couple of days ago, I had a mom of one of the kids that I tutor say, we need to cancel this week. Me and my daughter are sick. And so I just texted her back and basically said, okay, thanks for letting me know. I'll be praying for you. And she texted back saying, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So generally, something like that, it's simple. I mean, it points out clearly I'm a religious person, and questions can be asked at that point, but something simple like that. And generally you get positive responses. I've never had, not that it isn't bad to get a negative response, but I don't think I can't think of any situation where I've gotten a negative response telling someone I'll pray for them. And it has led to other, Demetrius is laughing.
I had negative responses.
Yeah, and that may happen.
And the reason why this pastor found that this approach isn't, I mean, this approach isn't it, but it's a way to mark out, I'm a Christian, I also care about you, and there's my relationship with God defines who I am and defines how I deal with problems and how I would deal with your problem if I were you. Like I'll pray for your son. Small things like that, they can hopefully, and you can gauge how the person responds. They'll know you're a Christian. You've sort of planted a flag that says, here I am, and you've left it. And then you could sort of advance the flag a foot further the next time you have a conversation about that thing or about any other thing, to try and develop, instead of just being nice to someone for 10 years, hoping for the perfect moment to spill the entire gospel to the person. Because you can try that, or you can incrementally plant flags during the course of conversations, letting them know you're a Christian and how you live and how you think. Andrew gave one small example of what that could look like. And faith flags are not everything you should do, but they're a way to mark out, this is who I am to people who don't know you or people who you want to know better. He gave an example of, he's using specifically work examples, but it doesn't matter if you're at work or not. You can apply them any way you want. He gives an example, if someone who you work with figures out a really complicated problem. He gives the example of, you could say something like, I'm really glad you're on the team. God sure gave you a mind to solve really hard problems. And just to leave it at that, or similar things. But there's many ways that you can work in little flags about that you're a Christian during the course of normal conversation.
Pointing to creation is great. I mean, when people are talking about the weather, what a beautiful sunrise God gave us this morning. So something like that is a very tangible, usable faith flag that will often, at least in the public schools I work at, will give you weird looks sometimes. Like, creation, what? Crazy, but it's good.
I mean, he gave an example of if someone compliments a presentation you did at work, and you can apply it any way you want, but he gave the example of, you could use that as an opportunity to say something like, thanks for your encouragement. I'm paraphrasing what he said because he writes in kind of a stilted way, but if you knew how, I wish you knew how scared I was yesterday before I gave the presentation, but God calmed me down and helped me be able to focus. Something very short and very simple. And that can lead toward a lot of things in shorter bursts, but in the end, much faster than waiting for the perfect moment to have 10 minutes to tell someone about the gospel, and it'll take 5 years. 5 years of going to Starbucks and being friendly to the same barista, but never quite having the perfect moment to spend 10 minutes telling the barista about the gospel. Well, you could just work in very small things through the course of a year as you go there every morning or once a week or whatever the case is, and proceed from there and ask for God for opportunities to do more or to say more. The pastor who I was talking about in Illinois, he gave an example of how he was able to develop a really good relationship with a waitress at a restaurant he and his wife went to all the time in their hometown. It's a waitress. He didn't it's not like he has a lot of time for sustained conversation. But over the course of a year after reading this book and really thinking, I can be an evangelist without spending 10 minutes going through the entire gospel presentation. I can do it in small, very deliberate steps, in very small steps. He was able to develop a nice relationship with a waitress, and he and his wife were able to talk to her about marriage problems she was having, and he was able to share the gospel with her. No, she didn't fall on her knees and accept Christ when when she asked about marriage problems, but he's able to tell her about the gospel and to bring spiritual wisdom to her life, and she trusted him enough to talk with him. Not because he's a nice guy, because Jehovah's Witnesses are nice people too. A lot of Muslims are nice people too, although there are a lot of people who aren't Christians who are really nice people. But because she knew he was a nice guy, and she knew he was a Christian, and she knew he cared about him, and he'd worked enough little markers in and advanced the goalposts throughout his small, almost meaningless chit chat he had with her over the last year, that now she felt she could come to him and ask questions about things that were really bothering her, that it's really causing her a lot of pain in her heart and in her mind, in her life. But if he hadn't tried to work in little things, she would never have told him about what she was struggling with, because she wouldn't know anything other than he's a nice guy, and he'd still be waiting for that perfect moment to get 10 minutes alone so he can tell her the gospel. He probably still wouldn't have found that perfect moment, because he only sees her when he goes there for breakfast in the morning, and she has a lot of other people to talk to.
Yeah, one of the guys that has probably discipled me the most spiritually worked as a tool and die maker at the shipyard up in Bremerton for like 45 years or some such thing. And while he was there, it's similar to a lot of government institutions like the schools that I work at. You can't openly talk about the gospel. You get fired instantly. And so he did basically exactly what this book is talking about over 40 years of his career, where he would bring his Bible to work sometimes. People knew that he was a Christian. He would occasionally mention stuff that part of his Christian faith, or mention that he was going to church, but that was coupled with the fact that he was a man of integrity, and he had options to kind of cheat and didn't. And he was very competent at his job, and he had a healthy, thriving marriage, and people knew it. And it just a lot of aspects of his life, the way he worked, the kind of character that he had, really defined him, and people saw that. And he had, I think there were at least 3 different instances where he was able to lead someone to the Lord, not at work, but at least one time I remember him telling me about somebody came up to him in the middle of a shift and said, "Can you tell me more about Jesus?" And he said, "Yeah, meet me at my house after work." And he led the guy to the Lord. And of course, he was involved in the church and had a big impact on other people, including me outside of work. But even in his work, he changed many people's lives and had the opportunity he and his wife did marriage counseling. And there were a lot of lives that he was able to shape and change as a result of just being faithful and putting out these simple faith flags on a consistent basis.
Any thoughts on faith flags or anything? Because we can keep talking forever, but do you guys have any thoughts?
I actually have a story from last night about this very topic. I was talking to my friend Ron, the guy who I said is kind of a deist, and it's kind of sounding like he's moving more towards agnosticism, unfortunately, as in like you cannot know if there's anything out there. But last night we were talking about relationships, because he and I are in similar boats looking for a new relationship. And the conversation kind of steered towards happiness. Mm-hmm. And I told him, I said, well, I know exactly what can make you happy, but I know you don't want to talk about that. Kind of put a little jab in there. And it didn't, that little flag didn't lead to a conversation about the gospel, but it did lead to a conversation about the existence of a God person. And the analogy I used was the logic statement about the universe, that anything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. Right. And what could that possibly be? Right. And that conversation, he said that's an interesting way to think about it. I'll keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. And I took that victory as it was, and I changed the subject, and we moved on to other topics. Yeah. But that was the little tiny bit of water I put on that seed. And then I moved on.
that's a perfect example. And of course, the fact that the world has a cause, you look at how personal the world is and how much there's not just intelligence in the world, but there's beings with sentience and personality, and the relationalness of these beings in the world make you think the cause can't just be some impersonal force. There has to be a person behind the word. And of course you can go down that track further, but yeah, that faith flag is great, and you'll have the opportunity to hopefully have further conversations with him.
Ralph and Char, do you guys have any thoughts?
I was at the gym the other day, and I was watching this gentleman who was doing some particular exercise. And to me, it didn't look like how he could do it. He was way overweight, but he was doing some amazing things. So I went over and struck up a conversation with him and commented on that. And he mentioned something about Christ in his life. And so I thought, okay. So we got to talking, but the more I talked to him, he didn't have much knowledge. He did confess that he wasn't really living for Christ. He wanted to, but he couldn't. And sometimes you don't always run into people who are on their way, but people who may think they're on the way or in the way, but they're not. Or maybe they are, but they just haven't had sufficient teaching. So anyway, we got into a good conversation there, and we kind of walked along and gave testimony how, Christ was in my life, how that came about, and the changes that took place. Because he was talking about these certain temptations he just couldn't overcome, he seemed. And there again, like you say, you only have so much time. The guy's got to finish up his thing. And well, I had about a 15-minute talk there. So there's not just people who are lost and seeking, or are lost, period. People who think they've heard a message and maybe it was an incomplete message, or maybe they didn't really fully understand it. So I'm hoping to have more conversation with him as I'll see him again and see how that goes. So there again, another faith flag would be working with people who may not be there, may or may not be there, but finding out for sure and then moving them on.
Yeah, excellent.
You can use, if you try, if you make it a habit, and I'm not saying that I'm perfect at this at all, but if Christians make it a habit to ask God for opportunities just to plant small flags in the course of conversations throughout the day, I think we'll be looking for them, and we'll do it much more often. And you can turn any discussion, any situation to the gospel, even in short bursts. I was talking with my sister last week, who's going through a lot of stuff, and I'm the only person in my immediate family who's a Christian. So I'm talking to my sister. She's a few years older than me, and she doesn't really want to talk about whatever is really bothering her, but she decided to talk about politics for some reason. And she mentioned that she said she intuited from my Facebook page that I'm a disgruntled conservative. And so what I did is, and I don't want to talk about, I never really do want to talk about partisan politics, about the Republicans, the Democrats, but what I did is I seized that opportunity, and I said, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I said, you probably think I'm a disgruntled conservative because my values seem to line up a lot with what the GOP advocates. I says, but the reason why you think I'm disgruntled is because I don't really belong to the GOP. I said, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm a Christian. My conscience, my duty isn't to, I'm not here to advocate for the Republican Party or the Democrats. I'm here to advocate for Christ's value, for God's values in a world that's really messed up. And that's where my loyalty is. And then we got into a discussion about why are Christians always against the common things. And then we were talking about how Christians who do it the right way don't marry themselves to a political party, but try their best to be light for God's coming kingdom and for God's values in this world. And that's where our focus and emphasis should be. So she didn't want to talk about what is really bothering her. She just decided to mention politics, I think, because she didn't want to continue talking about whatever is bothering her. But I was able to use that to just give a brief explanation of and I was able to explain a good part of the gospel. But that's an example of how you can, if you're looking for opportunities in conversations, you can turn a conversation towards spiritual things just by talking about the values you have as a Christian. We could have gone on and had a big talk about the Republicans and the Democrats and Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but we didn't, because that's not really that important to me. In that context, I wanted to talk about God's values, God's ethics, and a Christian's motivation for advocating for any position in the public square or in private and in personal and private and public life.
And there's a couple of things I would add to that I think I've matured in, I guess, in the past few years. I used to be much more of a kind of disgruntled conservative, I don't know, a more impassioned, you guys think I'm already kind of crazy, but I was even more so when I was a teenager. But I'm trying to kind of calm down. So there's two things I would add to that, Tyler. One is, I think when you are out seeking to be an earnest, convictional Christian in the public square, wherever that happens to be, for me, it's typically in the public schools, which is it's a place filled with a very intentional agenda and a lot of propaganda. And if you run counter to that agenda, you are out on your face in a hurry. And so I have had to choose to pick my battles very carefully, to pick which hills I want to die on very carefully. And my approach, which is different than yours, and this is where it's probably helpful you're seeing different approaches, I've chosen to basically not talk about politics at all. I just don't want to die on that hill. And so I will be very nuanced if people start bringing that up, and try not to dig myself in too much there, and rather die on the hill of I'm a Christian, and similar to you, to say I hold Christian values, not Republican values, or not what you're thinking about as maybe conservative values, but Christian values. Here's the other piece that I would add to what Tyler mentioned is, I think there's a danger where we as Christians, maybe I can mostly speak for myself here, we try to put the cart of values before the horse of them actually believing in the Christian faith. And what I mean by that is it's easy to go to our non-Christian or not yet Christian neighbors or coworkers and say, how dare you be for killing babies in the womb? How dare you be for gay marriage, or these other things that are big in the culture that run counter to Christian values? And we try to argue them into a Christian value position before they've accepted the Christian faith at all, before they believe that the Bible has any credibility as a authoritative book. And what I've noticed is it seems kind of futile to try to convince people of our values before we've convinced them that the Bible has any authority, any right to have an influence over your life. I mean, honestly, if the Bible isn't true, who cares? Why not gay marriage? Why not any of these other things? There's nothing wrong with it, except for that God says that it's wrong. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is, you can get into discussions where you're trying to explain to people, here's why some of these ways, these places that the society is moving to are problematic. And you can get into this statistical discussion. There's books I can give you that talk about the dangers of homosexuality and stuff. But the reality is, the reason why I'm against it is because I think it runs counter to the way God wired the world. And until people are convinced that God is real and he's good and he wired the world in a certain good way, why would they care what I say or what I believe about abortion or any of this other stuff? So to be careful to not get caught up in the discussion of, you have to believe my values, these are the only right values, when why would they? They don't believe the Bible yet. So almost in many cases, maybe not in every case, but in many cases, have them come to faith first, have the Holy Spirit change their hearts first, and then we can explain the values from the Bible. And I think part of this is we can buy into a more secular view of how salvation works and assume that just by logic and reasoning we can persuade people into our position, where really it's the Holy Spirit. And you read some of these passages in the Bible, like Ephesians 4, about you used to be an old man, or Romans 6, and that old nature, those old cravings die when you get saved. And God makes you a new man, and you have a new nature and new cravings. And Romans 7, there's a battle between them, but there's a change in our appetites and in our desires that happens when we get saved, where we're willing to submit ourselves to the authority. And so understanding how dynamic and powerful salvation is, to where now you can start that conversation about why these cravings that you had pre-salvation should change.
Ralph, were you going to say something?
Long time ago.
I know.
Sorry.
No, you had mentioned briefly mentioned that the day that I went to the gym to see this, I didn't know I was going to see this guy, but I did pray that morning that for the Lord just give me an opportunity to talk to somebody that day in the gym, and that opportunity came. It's not something I do every day, but that day I did it, and it was like God just turned a little light on my head. Oh yeah, maybe I should ask more often, because I talk to a lot of people in the gym, but it's not necessary. There are some Christians in there and there's some who aren't. And on your present topic, when I was a young kid, long ago when I was very young, grew up in the society was more church oriented, and morals were out there. I mean, you can see it in TV programs, you can see it everywhere.
Exactly.
But as I got a little older, came out of the Navy, went back to school, took some psychology and classes like that. All of a sudden, well, you can't use the Bible as a means of authority in any argument. That's what they were teaching. And I said, who said you can't? I mean, you're telling me I can't, but who are you to tell me that I can't use this as an authority when our whole society is built upon the morals of the Bible, even though most people aren't saved, yet the morals are still there. The very foundings of the country were based on that. But we've steadily moved away from that, obviously.
Right.
So, like you say, I mean, I've seen this change, and it's come very quickly. And now it's like, if you represent or present yourself as a believer, it can make people angry. You can be persecuted, more so now than when I was a kid. So there's that to be thinking of also as you're out there wanting to present the gospel or display a Bible or some T-shirt, that some people are going to react to that. But like you say, it's an opportunity also to, with a symbol or a comment, to say something.
Yeah, and you start to learn what their real questions are. And you have something to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, take that mic. Yeah, take Ralph's microphone.
I was thinking about the relational aspect of this, and how Ralph was saying, like, sometimes there's tension. I have a friend who is hyper into evangelism and will just like take every conversation, and if there is not a faith flag opportunity, will like drill one in and just turn everything. And it's really harsh sometimes, and it makes me uncomfortable. And so I was just thinking about, why does that make me uncomfortable? And then another instance here is there's a lady who holds up a sign that says Zion, Isaiah 35:5, which is not a very helpful passage if you go look it up. It's kind of abstract. And she stands there every single day at rush hour. And you see these people trying desperately to make a mark. And sometimes it might be helpful and God could use it, but I like the direction of it starts with a relationship. And I'm trying to navigate the difference between being scared to stand out for Jesus and being reasonable and following cultural norms so that people understand and are responsive. And that was one thing I learned in Cambodia. When I'm going there, I can't just do certain things because I think it's normal. People will not be responsive to it. And I think we need to keep that in mind here too, that it's not like it's oh, I don't have the freedom to say this, or this is the wrong way to do it, but like, how can I love this person? What is this person's worldview, and how can I step into that in a way they'll understand?
I think that's really hard. It's really, I mean, people are different. I've known people who can have a gospel conversation with anyone. I've mentioned the older guy who's now passed away at the church I was at in Wisconsin. Some people are like that. Some people aren't. Some people are just super excited and can make opportunities to have conversations which to you might seem really weird and awkward, and you want to like back away like you don't really know who they are, like slowly back away or something. So I get that. I think it's always going to be hard. I think you're going to always have to balance. I don't want it to be awkward, but I do need to be a little bit bold. I do need to be bold to some extent. We can't be turtles or kittens who always hide under the sofa, but we don't want to be offensive jerks either, or the people waving signs at rush hour, which there's zeal there, but I don't know what's accomplished. Maybe something is, but there needs to be a balance between the two. So I think it's always going to be difficult. One thing the author really wants to, I think the author knows, I think the author is operating from a perspective that a lot of people have been taught the confrontational style, how to initiate a conversation that leads someone through the Romans road, how to initiate a conversation and in a very bold sort of way that might really not work for a lot of people. So the author's burden is to really talk about relationships and incrementally waving the flag for Christ in normal conversations. So he gives a few tips, and then we'll move on to faith stories, which is what he talks about next. For planting these little faith flags, what he recommends is he has 6 things. Number 1, he says, make it fit. So make it fit the flow of the conversation. Don't just interject some weird anecdote from left field that has nothing to do with anything that you're talking about. If you go to IHOP and you order food and you're not planting a faith flag if you order waffles and then throw in an anecdote about how you were really scared once because you almost died, but God gave you strength and that made you know he existed. She'll just be standing there like, so make it fit a natural course of conversation, which is why he gave the example of when someone compliments you for doing a really good job on something at work, say, thanks, God gave me the strength to get through it, God gave me the insight to do it, or something really short and something that fits what the conversation is. Don't just come out of the woodwork with something strange that doesn't fit. He says, keep it short. He says a faith flag should take no longer than a few seconds, like a sentence or two, just a brief mention. And the point is to just let them know you're a Christian and see if a conversation develops from there. Or when you have a conversation next time, they'll remember that you're a Christian and you can start slowly advancing the goalposts depending on how your conversation goes. He suggests keep it general, so don't give an anecdote about why Baptists are the only true Christians or something like that. Don't give an anecdote about how all Nazarenes are really fake Christians or something weird. Please don't be a partisan sort of Christian.
I went out when I was at Bible college. Well,
Oh,
went
yeah,
to
I remember
seminary,
you-
but
yeah. Yeah, you
it
told me
was at
about
a
that.
Bible college, and they had the seminary and Bible college combined, and so we would go out once a week on Friday night into Madison, which is a very liberal capital of Wisconsin, a lot of universities there, and we'd go out and witness and do more of the confrontational style. Hey, what do you know about Jesus? Let's talk and take 30 seconds, a minute to talk to people. And I remember we would do two people kind of tag team things. And so I was with another younger kid who was in the college, and this guy was asking, like, what are you guys? You're like Christian? He's like, no, we're Baptist. I was like, no, we're Christian. Like, yes, true, we're Baptist, but salvation is broader than just being a Baptist.
There are Christians who aren't Baptists. It is crazy.
It's true.
They should be Baptists, but that's okay. So
There's good people who don't use Apple computers. Anyways.
Let's move on to, remember, keep it general, okay?
Okay.
Let's move on. Yeah. Well, this costs a fraction of what your Apple products cost.
Yeah, but this works so much better.
No, it does not. What happened to your computer? Oh, it's broken. Okay, so
So easy.
your Mac. Okay, so the other thing he suggests is to keep it positive. So, I mean, you need to be you, but what the author suggests is a faith flag is not necessarily when people ask you to go to a bar after work with them to say, I used to drink before I became a Christian. That he's suggesting that's not the kind of, yes, you're certainly saying you're a Christian, but all they get from that is that you just, that Christianity is moralistic, that it's a list of things that you don't do now that you're a Christian.
You're not going to make Christianity sound good that way. You're trying to, I think, is it C.S. Lewis who says, like, you're trying to kind of woo people to faith. And if you're out trying to date somebody, you don't just give them the list of, I don't do this, I don't do that, I don't, like, that's going to drive them away in a hurry. We're trying to, like, make Christianity sound good because it is good. And
it's I'm not saying that you don't ever tell people that there is bad news that makes Jesus's good news so good. What the author's point is that you need to get to know people so that when you are in a position to explain the truth of the gospel, they'll be able to accept it better because you're not some stranger who's telling them they're a sinner who's going to hell. You're the nice person who they know and trust is a decent human being who they know because you've developed a relationship with them. So what he's suggesting is to advance a relationship where they know you're a Christian, to not use negative things as faith flags. He's not saying you should never explain things. He's just suggesting to try and make them more positive.
trust is huge. Do you guys want to get, so I've had, I'm sure at this point, hundreds of conversations with unbelievers about Christianity, sometimes just in a faith flag context, sometimes more in depth than that. Want to guess what the biggest objection in this area, at least, like in Washington State, what is the biggest objection? This is somewhat anecdotal because it's my experience, but what is the biggest objection that I've heard to Christianity? What do you guys think? Related to that, yeah, it's actually hypocrisy. They'll say Christians are hypocrites. It's not a argument they don't believe in some sort of one of the big arguments for God or arguments for, it's not a logical argument. It's Christians are hypocrites. And the only way that we can really challenge that, because it's true, a lot of Christians are hypocrites. Well, we're still sinners. We're not perfect yet. But the only way we can really combat that argument is by being unhypocritical ourselves, by being authentic and people who are worthy of trust ourselves. That's how you can respond to people that say, oh, all Christians are just hypocrites. I can't believe that. I've heard that argument countless times, especially among young people, especially among teenagers. It's a very common argument. So trust is massive, which gets back to the relationship part. Go ahead, Rob.
As far as the hypocrites go, when I've encountered that, I just say, you're right, all Christians are hypocrites, and so are you. I said, we're all hypocrites. The difference is that I'm not perfect, but I'm saved.
Right.
And then they wonder, well, what's that? Saved from what? It kind of goes from there. But,
Yeah.
but the idea,
that's good.
yeah, the hypocrite thing is one that I heard a lot also, but when you think about it, everybody's a hypocrite. They're condemning it, well, but they're saying, well, you say you're not as a Christian, but that never came up. But that's their judgment, their point of view.
Yeah.
That's a good way to get started, though.
Yeah, and you can agree with them. That's an excellent approach. Thanks.
So in our last few minutes, the author suggests doing a few other things. Well, the last two things he mentions about planting flags, letting people know you're a Christian. He says, when you do that, he says, look for a response from people. Sometimes they may respond positively. Other times they may respond negatively or pretend you didn't say it. And just gauge how you should. Don't just continue pushing if someone obviously doesn't like the fact that you mentioned that. Just try and be nice and get to know them more before continuing to try. Hopefully we understand how to have conversations with people and how to tailor the way we do things. But his point is to plant small incremental flags to advance your relationship with the person, to let them know that you're a Christian. I'll leave with one thing and then we'll be done. What the author recommends, he says that anyone who's a Christian has had times in their life when God has helped you through a very particularly difficult time, or has given you strength in a very difficult time, or when God has blessed you when you've needed him, or helped you through a time when you've been hurt or didn't understand. What the author suggests is that you make a list of several of those instances and sort of almost write them out so you can explain them concisely and coherently, and use these personal testimonies of God's grace in your life in the course of normal conversation if you have a little bit more time. If you have a little bit more time. And he gives a few examples of that. He gives an example about if you're talking with someone who had a lost business opportunity or something. He just gives a few random examples, but you can tailor them any way you like. He gives the example of you can use, if you've had a similar situation, you can use that as a segue into the gospel. So if you're talking with someone who had a really good business opportunity but lost it, or something like that, you could say, if this is you, a few years ago, I had a business deal fail and it almost killed me. I'd worked on it for months and put everything else on hold. And the bank was calling. I couldn't sleep at night and was having chest pains, and I had no other option but to trust God with my business. I realized I needed to work smart and do my best work, but at the end, God controls the results. I don't like to lose, but I have peace of mind knowing God is running the show. That's an example. But what he's saying is you should take times when God has shown grace in your life and think about them, write them down, and have them filed in your mind so you can bring them to the forefront during conversations with people who you know or are trying to develop relationships with. So this is a little more than just a small sentence or something here. This is a still short, but a little longer opportunity for you to explain how God and your salvation through Jesus is working in your life, has helped you, has strengthened you, etc. You're explaining how God's worked in your life as a way to develop interest and show the person what a relationship with Jesus looks like in good times and in bad times. I think all of us are capable of doing that, of thinking of situations where God has helped us or strengthened us, I'm not talking about how someone mysteriously sent you $200 in the mail one day. I'm not talking about just happy things. I'm also talking about how God has helped you in very difficult times. Might not have taken the pain away, but maybe he helped you get through it. All of us have had that. We can think about it, we can write it down so that we can interject these things, if appropriate, when we're having conversations with people who don't know Jesus, who don't know the gospel. And the author really recommends that, and I think it's a really great idea. Any other thoughts on that? And we're about done for today. Any other thoughts? Tim, the voice of God, anyone there? No one?
Yeah, I'm here. I just kind of agree with some things. Just one thing I want to say concerning Marion's situation when she's with that person that likes to find a little hole and drive through it and make sure they share the gospel. It might make her uncomfortable, but she should pray that God would use what he's saying in the person's heart. When we used to go out with Evangelism Explosion or with the Navigators, we went out with 2 or 3 people, and one person would speak, whoever related to the person, and then the other 2 were praying that the gospel, the devil wouldn't close the door on the gospel. So you might cringe, but you need to pray too that it would have fruit.
Yeah, prayer is powerful.
Well, on that note, let's close in prayer, and we will we'll continue this next week. So, Andrew, could you pray to close us?
God, thank you for this time where we can think about how to share your truth more wisely. God, I pray that you would give us the boldness. It is hard, especially in our culture here in Washington, to share the gospel with people because you often feel like you're being judged as a dinosaur or something else. And so give us boldness, give us wisdom in what to say and how to say it. God, bring us into relationship with people who don't know the gospel or don't know it fully, whether at the gym or at work or in the other areas of our lives. I pray that you would bring people to us who are ready to hear the gospel, and that you would give us a sensitivity to your spirit as he is working on their hearts and minds, so that what we say is planting seeds and watering seeds that would be changing their lives, so that they would be open to coming to a saving knowledge of Christ. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.